Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Parashat Talk. I'm Avi Grossman. With us tonight, our special guest, Rabbi Johnny Solomon. Rabbi Solomon is a teacher, writer, educator, quite popular in the educational circuit around here among the Anglos. And this week, we have to make note of the passing of two important rabbinic figures. I was a little bit late on this one. I didn't mention it last Parsha Talk Thursday night, the last night of Hanukkah, because I was still as yet unaware. I heard the next morning from during Rav Schechter's shir that Rabbi Fabian Schoenfeld, who is the longtime Rav of the Young Israel Kew Gardens Hills. Rabbi Solomon, you've been to Kew Gardens Hills? You knew Rabbi Schoenfeld?
I knew of him. I've listened to shirim from him. I've never been to Kew Gardens, but his name went very, very far. Yeah.
So I grew up in Kew Gardens Hills. I was on the south side of town. Rabbi Schoenfeld's shul, the Young Israel Kew Gardens Hills, was on the north side. It still is there. His son, Rabbi Joel Schoenfeld, the Rabbi Schoenfeld Jr. is still there. Rabbi Steinberg was the longtime rabbi of the Young Israel Queens Valley, which is on the south side. And in between the two, there are many more shuls, and since then, Yeshiva Gedolas. Rabbi Steinberg, thank God, is alive and well. He's just retired now. Rabbi Marcus took that pulpit. Rabbi Marcus had a little bit of shul across the street from the Young Israel of Kew Gardens Hills. So we note his passing, and God willing, we'll give him more attention in one of the upcoming Parsha talks. Also, last night we heard Rabbi Henkin, Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin, passed away, the grandson of the Rabbi Henkin from New York, as Torah Rav, who was basically the premier posek in New York until the coming of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and then he had a colleague. And we also would like to make better notice of these things. We want to give that more attention, but that's not tonight's plan. Instead, we have to talk about the Parsha tonight. And tonight, I find that this week's Parsha has a lot to do with current events. The Israeli government I think it officially fell, and we're going to elections in March. Or maybe they're avoiding it. Whatever it is, we're having elections. Political parties are shaking up. They're saying this could be the end for Netanyahu. And they've also imposed a lockdown, apparently. Coming Sunday, we're going to be locked down again for a really long time, and that has economic repercussions, many of which I've been told by my friends who know economics better than I do, that those repercussions will only start feeling them sometime later. And of course, America is undergoing the United States of America, major regime change due in January, major economic repercussions for everything that's been going on there. This week, we read about how the predicted famine. Joseph told the Pharaoh at the time that his portentous dream was concerning 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Joseph said that Pharaoh should basically tax the people's produce 20% during the years of plenty so that they would have something during the 7 years of famine. And Joseph's family joined him basically 2 years in to ride out the last 5 years of the famine. And then, interestingly enough, Parashat Vayigash returns to the first 2 years of the famine, how Joseph had to sell the grain and other supplies that they had stored up. Once again, 20% tax that he had taken from the people of Egypt. He's selling it obviously to the people of Egypt and also to surrounding lands, apparently, that were also suffering from this great famine. Canaan is not Egypt. Different economy, the different way of growing things, but apparently Egypt was a superpower at the time, and the Canaanite city-states, of which we read so much about in the Bible, were basically vassals of the Egyptians and depended on them for their food. And Joseph was basically selling back this very food. Now, I know some people in today's political systems would say, socialism, the government should just share the food with everybody. And even people who are more of a conservative or libertarian stance would say, government took all that food, basically that wealth, from the people, 20% tax for 7 years. Perhaps they should then be redistributing it equitably among the people, or selling it back to foreigners. But instead, it says that Joseph basically sold it back to the Egyptians themselves and created a serf society. First, they had to sell everything they had, and then all their land, and then they basically sold themselves, and he repopulated the whole country. He took people from where they lived here and put them in the cities, and only the priestly class was spared paying this food fee. And that's basically also what happened to the Hebrews. They were also got their food provided to them by Pharaoh. Rabbi Solomon, tell me, are we undergoing something similar today? Are we going to see something like this? What could we learn from the parasha, that last part of the parasha, the socio-economic upheaval that was visited upon the Egyptians and the surrounding lands?
Okay, so I'm not an economist, but firstly, thank you for having me. The last part of the parasha, as we previously mentioned, is very, very curious because the tables are turned, right?
Yes.
Because here you have the Jewish family who've come down from Canaan, initially Yosef, and now his brothers and his father. And we're getting a glimpse of how Yosef is this very, very shrewd politician, right? He seems to understand how money, is of great value, but also how land is of great value, how food is of great value. And he both distributes some of those things, as you say, moving the people around, making sure that they feel in exile. So you have actually two exiled nations, as Chazal say. The Egyptians were exiled in their own land, and him and his family who are now exiled in their land. And so I suppose when I look at the parasha, I see this as being almost an immigrant country made up of people who were born there but not living where they were born, as well as people who've come from there, and trying to figure out how to deal with tough situations. And is that significant to us today? Most certainly. America, I'm originally from the UK, Israel, America and Israel are renowned as being countries with a huge number of people who have come from other countries. And they're all trying to deal with this great challenge of COVID and the economic implications of that. And the role of government and governance is clearly a very, very a big question. And what we get from Parashat Vayigash is careful planning can change things, perhaps for the better, perhaps for the worse, but the role of government is clearly a very, very major question. Also, don't forget that Yaakov meets Paro, and they seem to have a very good, at least, encounter there. Yaakov blesses Paro, but then we know what's going to be happening soon. The Shibud begins really at the end of Parashat Vayigash in one way or another. So to what extent do you maximize authority to benefit your population and others, I think is a very relevant question for us today.
I'm actually quite scared because we knew about Joseph's plan. He said it to Pharaoh. That's why Pharaoh chose him for the job. He was the one who foresaw the famine coming. He's the one who was able to tell them, okay, we have to save up 20% of what we have, the Chimeshet Eretz Mitzrayim. And it didn't tell us that his plan was to sell it back to everybody. Right. As we know, food, the demand for food is basically a straight line on the graph, but the supply drops. And basic economics say that when you have something like that, the price goes up. All the gold, all the silver, all the wealth starts flowing into Egypt. I think it's almost scary because I wonder, where is the wealth going to start flowing in if we keep this up with the pandemic and the solution lockdowns? It's almost frightening when you think about how we could be seeing the beginnings of another revolution. Rabbi Solomon also talked about the beginnings of the servitude. I remember reading an essay years ago saying that this is the foundation of anti-Semitism, that the Egyptians became strangers in their own land, while they see these strangers, a new immigrant population, which is even quite small, become the privileged class, rivaling that of only, once again, the priesthood. If you translate Kohanim in this case, I think the Onkelos does say it's Kum Raya. It doesn't mean Kohen Own as in the chieftain of a place. It doesn't mean the political leadership. It means the clergy, the religious ones, the idolatrous priests. And that is almost frightening. I hope it doesn't end up, but we have family, obviously, in Chutz La'aretz still. You came from the United Kingdom. I came from New York. And I worry so much about family and friends we left there. Let's look a little bit about the beginning of the Parsha, shall we?
With pleasure, but I just want to add something. You mentioned that the fear of anti-Semitism, but don't forget where Yosef's family is in Goshen is actually out of the limelight for the majority of Mitzrayim. In fact, the Midrashim make it quite clear that Yosef is choshesh that they will seem to be a people of plenty versus the others who are struggling. And one of the Midrashim quotes a pasuk from Mishlei, Al titader lifnei hamelech, be very careful. So though, and we see that later on as well, they need to keep their heads low. They are disconnected. The actual family themselves aren't complicating the matters. And Yosef himself, who is still perceived by the Mitzrayim as having this kind of dual, well, he's initially, at the beginning of the parasha, he's a Mitzri. But by the middle of the parasha, he has this duality. They hear him speaking to his brothers, and they're not quite sure what to do with him. And so I suppose embedded in Parashat Vayigash is the shifting perspective of who is Yosef in the eyes of the Mitzrim. And the Medrash mentions that as well. And it says, Paro and his servants revered Yosef. They say, yeah, but not all his servants. Once they heard of what had happened, they changed their tune to him.
I remember seeing a recent Perush that said, there was a period of time, it's a big machlokas, where how this fits into the biblical narrative, when this occurred, but there was a Hyksos occupation of Egypt. And people have sometimes had foreigners as their rulers, and it might have been beneficial for this particular pharaoh, who may or may not have been an Egyptian, for all we know, to have someone who is noticeably Hebrew, a noticeable foreigner, be the tough guy, the bad cop, the one who's exploiting them just to feed them. Whereas Pharaoh himself, what do you know? That's the way our system of government works. Like in England, you have the crown. You have the monarch, and she's just a figurehead. And
Right.
if you're not happy with what government is doing, you have to stick it to the prime minister. And Yosef was basically in that role, that he has to do all the things that are unpleasant that the Pharaoh himself doesn't want to have to do. And also, I'm a little bit concerned. Yes, Goshen is separate, and Yosef has many brothers. They have many children, and some of them have grandchildren, and obviously they're going to have more children. I don't think they could have stayed there even after a decade. How many of them were actually staying in Goshen? How many were saying, okay, I'm going to move around a little bit? And
well, the Rashi in Parashat Shemot tells us they weren't just in Goshen. However, in our parasha, they were. So there's this shift that takes place. Correct. The anti-Semitism that rises occurs when they leave Goshen and become kind of commonplace elsewhere. Obviously, what you interpret from that is an interesting question. Rav Hirsch, for example, speaks about Goshen as really the protector of the Jewish culture, that they're away from the alien culture.
And hopefully the Gar'in, the nucleus of the people, go there, even though, yes, there are some people who attempt to leave. Just this week, I saw that someone wanted to claim Goshen is actually just the borderland, as close to Canaan as you can get. And that's why you would have, for example, the not so clear story, Chazal have much to add to the story that's described in Divrei Yamim, that Ephraim's own descendants, while Ephraim was still alive, Ephraim is Yosef's son, Ephraim's own descendants tried to have a mass exodus. They just wanted out of Egypt, and they left, and they got massacred by the Philistines or some other people. It says the native people killed them when they're looking for their livestock. And Chazal say, yes, that was an original exodus. People getting fed up of being stuck in Goshen, perhaps early in the servitude, and that's kind of scary. Chazal said that Joseph was the first of the brothers to die, Levi was the last, and that's when the servitude really started. Yet it doesn't tell you that Ephraim and Menashe had passed away. So apparently Ephraim and Menashe, Yosef's own sons, were around to see the beginning of the enslavement of the Jewish people. Let me ask you a question here. I noticed, and you noticed this also, Yosef keeps referring to Yaakov as my father, Avi. And Yehuda refers to Yaakov as Avinu. Or at least sometimes he refers to him as Avinu, our father.
Is Avichem as well.
Yeah. And then Yosef keeps stressing my father. You tell my father. He could have said our father, but he's focusing on the singular possessive. What do you think that teaches us?
You know, I was taken by this because the one thing you imagine, you are kind of making this as a screenplay, and you know what's happened before. You're going to be saying to yourself, okay, remember not to say the trigger words. Don't try and make it like you got a special relationship with dad. And then he keeps on talking about, I'm his son and he's my father. And you're thinking, why? They're going to go crazy. They're going to get so upset. And I think part and parcel of it is he's testing them. He's doing exactly what he knows are triggers. He's saying, I do have a unique bond with my father, and I'm not going to hide that. Right? You got jealous by it, but I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. I'm interested as to whether you're able to be different people. And the brothers are. They don't rise to the very fact that he says these words. He gives special gifts to Binyamin, how he hugs him with a greater enthusiasm as he does to the other brothers. All these things could be reason to get aggrieved with Yosef, but they don't. And the brothers have demonstrated that they've done tshuva, that they're different people.
I remember reading in the Midrash says, so I have to look this back. If you remember what the Midrash says, I guess that's one of the first books you also read. I read that before I knew to seriously study Tanakh or Chumash. And there is a Midrashic idea that they brought there that Yosef had dreamt that his brothers would bow down to him. At least, no, he dreamt that the stars and the sun and the moon were going to bow down to him. And they even realized, Yaakov himself said, are we going to all bow down to you? Am I going to come and bow down to you with your mother and your brothers? And he basically gave that interpretation. And that did not come true as of yet. When the brothers came and bowed down to Yosef at the end of last week's parasha to plead for Binyamin's, plead for his freedom, Yehuda says, "Take me instead of him." That still was not yet the fulfillment of his dream, even though it says when he first saw them also, he remembered the dreams. But once again, that's only 10 brothers bowing down to him. And it was only much later, when Yaakov Avinu had passed away, that they all bowed down to him, that the prophecy actually came true, when all the brothers bowed down to him properly as it should have been. And it says that, who was it that they sent to talk to Yosef? It says they sent to Yosef to try to make sure that he wasn't going to take his revenge. Now that Yaakov died, says that was Bilhah. Bilhah was his mother's maidservant who apparently continued to raise him after his mother's own death when he was 9. And she came and bowed down to him, so that fulfilled it, because you needed all the brothers plus Bilhah. So my question is, Yosef sees that his prophecies or his visions of the future are coming true. He predicted the famine. He predicted what happened to Sar Mashkim. He predicted what happened to the Saraphim, the butler and the baker. And he's seeing that which he's done has also come true. Why does he have to bring it about himself then? Why is he manipulating things to bring this about if he knows that it's going to come true? He has confidence in that God has shown him this. What are we to learn from his manipulation of these events?
Okay, so I'll take two things, two seemingly unrelated. Perhaps we'll find a way to bring them together. I'll go back to your point and then answer that one. Okay. He has these two dreams, and the first doesn't involve his mother, and the second does. And it's only when he conveys his second dream that Yaakov gets aggrieved. And you wonder why. What is it that he says in the second dream that makes Yaakov more bothered than necessarily the first? And I think it's because he brings his mother into it. Now, why do I mean that? You see, Yosef, there's two ways of looking at Yosef's life. One is that he had everything. His father gave him gifts, that he was the choicest son, etc. The other is, though, that actually he was a victim. He didn't really have a brother, right? His brother was, a baby at the time. He lost his mother at a young age. Whenever he spoke about his mother, he was really assigning towards himself a certain sense of victimhood. Now, the truth is, the brothers were also victims. Why? Because their mothers were less beloved than Rachel. So whenever he spoke about his mother, he was basically saying, my life is worse than yours. And they were saying, what are you talking about? We've got trouble. So what's interesting is, in this week's parasha, he doesn't mention his mother. They focus on the thing which binds them together, which is the father. True, he talks about it as my father rather than yours. But there's no mention of Rachel. Now, not to say that you shouldn't mention Rachel, it's a beautiful thing. But the way in which he does so then is as if to say, to score a card to say, my life was more difficult than yours. That's what doesn't happen in this week's parasha. And I think they're able to find the greater common ground of that shared parent. That's the Varishon. Okay. In terms of your question about why does he push it? Well, let's go and reference why does he have this unique bond with his father Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky tells this beautiful, beautiful Torah about in about 5 different places, kind of almost as a theme, about the Torah of Shem Be'era that Yaakov learns, because he knows that he's going to have to be ready when he goes to the house of Lavan. His father is Yitzchak, he's a Gadol Hador, but he doesn't have what he calls Torat HaGalut in order to sustain himself in the house of Lavan. So he learns the Torah of these spiritual survivors, Shem and Ever. What does he do? He then passes it on to Yosef, because he says, I know that there's going to be a time when you're on Galut, and I know that the Torah I've taught you until now is great for the base Medrash, but it's not particularly useful when you're in Mitzrayim. Yosef knows that he's destined for greathood. Yosef knows that he has a mission. And so right now, as you say, he's an economist. Yeah? He's actually not. He's doing good things, but he's not doing great things. He knows there's more to come. And so he's waiting to realize the halacha lamasa aspect of Torah Shem Ve'ever, of being that voice in an alien country, not just being the person who makes good fiscal decisions. And I think that's why he continues to push.
I like that one. I think there's a classic essay, which is the transcription of a classic speech that Rabbi Soloveitchik gave, comparing his own experience with that of Yosef. Of course, Rabbi Soloveitchik's name was Yosef. Rabbi Soloveitchik explained why it is that he deferred. He had a difference of opinion with that of his most of his family, who were classically not involved in the Zionist movement. Somewhere actually,
right? Yeah.
And then Rabbi Soloveitchik was saying that Joseph dreamt a dream, just like Yosef basically saw ahead. The reason the dream involved, let's say, stalks of wheat, How is that? Why did the dream use that imagery? It's because Yosef would be providing food for everybody. Yosef saw ahead to a different mode of existence. The people were, Yosef's family mostly were shepherds and goat herds in Eretz Canaan, and something would have to change. It'd have to become more worldly. They have to get involved in the economics of feeding larger populations, whole nations, and the brothers just didn't see that. And so too, Rabbi Soloveitchik saw of himself as someone different than his brothers and his family, because he saw ahead that perhaps instead of fighting this movement, which is going to create a Jewish state and a whole new Jewish existence in the land of Israel, a redemptive existence, needed people to think differently. And yes, I think his words were almost prophetic. Things have certainly shown that Rabbi Soloveitchik was right. Nowadays, you have, maybe you saw this, the World Zionist Organization now has a large Haredi representation, and they've actually signed on to those things. I think this is the fulfillment, just like Yosef knew that his dreams, his vision of the future would have to come true, and he would have to seek to bring it about. So too, that's what happened with Rabbi Soloveitchik. He thought that the Jews have to participate in all that involved the state of Israel, and now we see it. It's true. Even those who classically were opposed to these things have to acknowledge that we need to work with this. We need to work with this reality. I'm going to ask you another question over here. First of all, just more personally, when it comes to teaching these topics in school, someone pointed out, the whole idea of 2 weeks ago, the fact that the brothers would think to kill their brother, or that they would sell him to Arabs, for some money. Why should we kill him? We might as well make some money off of it. Mm-hmm. And there's other questions also, like the one we asked now, selling back the same food. We tax the people. We tax the people 20%, and now we're going to sell it back to them at exorbitant prices. What do you think? What kind of questions perhaps do you get from the younger people when they first learn these things as adults, younger adults? What kind of questions do they have? What are the more surprising ones you get, if any?
Well, actually, it's been a while since I taught much younger kids Chumash, but I do. And I think people want to relate to biblical personalities. Sometimes they struggle to make sense of a world that's less familiar to them. And sometimes they struggle to make sense of actions which seem to be either harsh or unexpected. Nevertheless, when you think about the difficult times of Sheba Mitzrayim, or coming up to Sheba Mitzrayim, it's hard to think that Yosef's attempts to try and provide for the people and yet maintain his position would be improper. Also, we have this issue. There's a great phrase that I learned from a book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. It's called the Curse of Knowledge. We know how the story ends. Yeah. I'd love to learn Chumash Bereshis. We have no idea what's coming next. But the thing is, most kids also kind of know what's coming next. But once you have no idea, you are more involved in the drama of things, and you're wondering, why is he doing that? It's as if, like the music would be a little bit kind of creepy. Really, he's going to do that? Or why would he make that choice? But we do relate to the biblical characters to Yosef and others with reverence. We attribute them great wisdom and deep, profound spiritual understanding. And even young people would say they must have known why they were doing what they were doing. In terms of wanting to kill a sibling, of course, this seems like a very difficult thing. But nevertheless, you then look back, and in all the sibling relationships from Bereshit until now, there's always one sibling who was either rejected or dejected. And you think it actually does follow a pattern. Moreover, let's not forget that until relatively recently, almost every family had kids who died from childbirth. The idea that you, Baruch Hashem, have a family and all of them live a good long life is a very modern idea. And moreover, the idea of revenge killings, of course, isn't something that we are interested in promoting today, but undoubtedly there are certain stories in Tanakh that come close to that. I think we kind of say that's what they did now. We do think of things differently, but that's the wisdom of the great Shvatim, of the Shiftei Kar. And we also look at the Mefarshim. The Mefarshim oftentimes will say this wasn't just an arbitrary act. They judged and they reached a ruling, and based on the conclusions they reached, this was the right thing to do. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu nudged them to make sure that Yosef didn't die, but instead survived.
You might have seen, maybe I'll send it to you afterwards, that a few years ago I put something online. I have a basic thesis that you mentioned every brotherly relationship that's in so far in this book is one of a brother either being rejected or dejected. I think I tried to expound on that and try to make it a little bit more so. You might notice that every time someone's described as a firstborn, every single firstborn, there might be many firstborns, but sometimes we don't hear about a particular person's own siblings. Anytime there's a sibling relationship and there's a firstborn, that firstborn is the reject by definition throughout the Torah and even into the next book, into the book of Shemot, which would be Exodus. We have that a firstborn is rejected and replaced as some sort of the chosen one, the one who gets to be the the carrier, the bearer of the torch, the part of the next generation, and the whole legacy of the father is carried by a younger son. And that's true with, I haven't found a single exception. And I was showing people, Yosef? Yosef is the biggest exception. There's a Yosef here just told me. Yosef is not the exception. Yosef is a middle child, basically. He had 3 younger siblings, according to the text. And he basically gets the birthright from his reject older brother, Reuven. And it continues like that throughout the book until we get to Moshe Rabbeinu, whose own older brother is not rejected, if only because, guess what? His older brother is not a firstborn. Aaron was only 3 years older than Miriam, where according to tradition, also basically the Pshat, Miriam was significantly older than both of them, so there's no one to get rejected. Let's ask a question about this one. Yaakov Avinu seems to have suffered a lot. He actually says so in this week's parasha. Pharaoh asks him, "How old are you?" And he says, "I'm 130. But believe me, my father lived to be 180. I'm just think I'm going to die now." He even says that. He wants to come and see Yosef. I got to see Yosef before I die. Better hurry up. And then he starts on his way to Egypt, and he gets to Beersheba, which is south of Hebron, because apparently they left Hebron and they headed south on the main highways. Yaakov Avinu offered sacrifice to God. And God's response, as though, remember, when you offer sacrifice, you have to pray also. That night, God came to him and told him, "Do not fear going down to Egypt." B'mashma, what's the implication? That was exactly what Yaakov was afraid of. Going down to Egypt frightened him. And just like everything, we see that Yaakov Avinu expresses his fears. He doesn't want his own son to leave. He's afraid that his youngest son will experience a tragedy just like his mother and his older brother. Yaakov himself has a lot of fear. What are we to make of this?
So, when I read through the parasha, I realized this isn't just localized to Yaakov. In fact, if I'd have to say a broad theme in Parashat Vayigash, other than, shall we say, rise to power, I'd say life and death. And let me just give you a few examples. Okay. At the beginning of the parasha, there's a worry that Binyamin is going to die on the journey, right? Then there's a fear that Yaakov will be frightened that Binyamin's been taken and he will die. Then Yehuda basically says, "I'm prepared to die if Binyamin, in order to protect my brother Binyamin." And then the brothers are worried about going back to Canaan, right? And so they're told not to be agitated on the way. And then we're worried about Yaakov making it to Egypt. And then when Yaakov sees Yosef, he says, "Amot apam." And then towards the end of the parasha, what are the Mitzrim saying? Well, of course, going back to what that flashback as you described, they said, "Why lama amut?" Right? Why should we die? Right? Nichyev lo yamut. We should live and not die. They say about Yosef, "Hechiatanu," you've saved our lives. And the last pasuk tells us, "V'yifru v'yirbu," and they were fruitful and multiply. So there is this constant wave of this fear of death and seeking life. And have you got to a point when you can accept death, or have you got more of a reason to live? And you see that with, again, not just with Yaakov, you see that with the brothers protecting Binyamin and how people relate to Yosef. And Parashat Vayigash really is a testimony to the efforts we go to live life to the full, to the motivation we have to maximize life, to what it takes to live, which is sometimes food, sometimes also it's a sense of positivity. We're right about the dikaon, the depression that Yaakov and others might suffer. And so it's a big snapshot about what we need to live and what we should do to avoid danger and death.
I like also a local Baal Musar likes to say that sometimes we forget, practically all the time, we forget that God is really in control. God has his will. God decides ultimately. Especially Lev Melachim, we have free choice because we're just we're not anybody really significant, but the people who are on top, kings and rulers, they actually are under God's control. They're just pawns in this game. And Yosef introduces himself to the brothers, and he tries to also, he's addressing obviously their fears. He sees it on their face. Ki nivhalu mipanav. The second he said ani Yosef, they were frightened of him. They had to take a step back. They had nowhere to run. They were trapped. And he says, "Don't worry, lo atem. You did not do this. Ki Elohim. It's God's. It was part of God's plan. He made me the ruler of Egypt here. It says, Vaisimeni of Lifaro, Adon Lechol Beito, Moshe B'chol Eretz Yisrael. 3 different jobs. He's Pharaoh's top advisor, and he's in charge of Pharaoh's household, and he also happens to be the ruler of all of Egypt. That's what Pharaoh let him do. But because we're friends of chiastic structures, he then says at the end, the brothers come and say, please don't kill us. That's at the end of Vayichi, like the very last thing that Joseph says in the entire book before he passes away. Well, he says one last thing before he passes away. He promises he'll get them out of there. He says God will get them out of there. He says it again. He says, this was not, you might have thought to do bad to me, but Halokim chashava l'tova. God thought to do good. This was all his plan. And they have to be reminded of this at the beginning and at the end. Despite their fears, it's all part of God's plan. And even the greatest people, the Shivtei Ka, have to be told this. They have to be reminded of this. It's Yosef himself who's the one who reminds them twice. And Yosef is the one who tells this to Pharaoh also. Pharaoh, your dreams are frightening you. Pharaoh was frightened. But he doesn't know what's going on. And he's quite bothered. So he needs someone, a nice Hebrew, to tell him, don't fear, this is part of God's plan. He's actually cueing you in on the future. Do you think if we had, hopefully, I wish, I heard that whole line, maybe one day we'll have a prophet in these days, or people who are actually quite smart enough, they could actually see, understand what's coming. How are we to make of most crises in life? How do we remind ourselves? How do we get that inner Joseph to tell us this is part of God's plan? How does one build up that sort of faith that even when Yaakov and his sons are deeply frightened, how does one keep his confidence and trust in God? If that's too hard a question, you could pass, by the way.
No, this is the ultimate question. I mean, ultimately, this is a question which even if we can't answer fully, we have to attempt to answer, because it's about our belief in a personal God. It's about our recognition that whatever happens is not just accompanied by, but kind of planned and led by Kadosh Baruch Hu. How does Yosef do it? First and foremost, I actually think he learns it from Yaakov. It's important to know that he has an incredible role model. In fact, as you were just talking, you just kind of gave me a chiddush. No, maybe it's not just a great chiddush. You know, Chazal asked this question. When Yosef and Yaakov come together, Yaakov says Shema, right?
Yes.
And the wonder is, why is he saying Shema? And Yosef isn't. What's the whole spiel? And there's lots of parshanot about it. I think in those words, Yaakov is reassuring Yosef this was God. You see, Yosef can say that to the brothers about him. But when he goes to his father Yaakov, this is where he says, maybe I really should have been in contact. Maybe really that is my bad, as they say. And Yaakov communicates in Shema Yisrael HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he runs the world. And that glimpse, that reassurance that Yaakov whispers really in Yosef's ear is an expression of what Yosef has learned from his father. And who taught it to him, not only from Yitzchak and Avram, but also, as I said before, Shem ve'Ever. Shem ve'Ever, they went through the worst crises, right? They saw there were the survivors of the Mabul and of the Migdal Bavel, and you think, why is the whole world being turned upside down? And yet they were these ambassadors of faith, right? Extraordinary ambassadors of faith. They didn't, again, live in the base medrash, like I said before, but instead they lived in this gritty world where things don't always make sense. And yet they taught this sense of loyalty, of tmimus. And that's what Yaakov went to learn when he went to the house of Lavan, in this overturned and confusing place where this Ramai is living. How do you maintain God in a world of lies, in a world of deceit? And it's to recognize that God can exist in a world of lies and deceit, because God is truth. Whatever happens in your relationship between Adam and Chaveroi, don't forget that Kadosh Baruch Hu is your God. And he learned that, and he taught that, and he brought that to Yosef. And Yosef had enough confidence to say to his brothers, as I say, but he needed a little bit of chizuk from his father when he felt he disappointed him. In terms of our lives, the world is a very confusing place. And how do we deal with the roller coaster of emotions, which can sometimes jar on our faith? The answer is, number one, to be humble and to recognize there are things we just don't understand. Number two, to recognize that God is omnipresent. Wherever you are, God's with you. Even in the most difficult of times, the most disappointing of moments, Kadosh Baruch Hu is there with you. And as a result of that, we say Shema Yisrael. We say morning and night. We say morning, right? In the morning when things are clear, we say Kadosh Baruch Hu is with me. But at night, I also say there are things I just don't understand. But I know, I affirm that you're with me. And so we're never alone. And being never alone means that we may not understand why everything is happening, but we feel protected, we feel confident, we feel loved, that we can go through things because we're not doing it on our own.
I'd like to close with an idea from the Haggadah. We thank God because we say that he was Hishevet HaKetz. He calculated the end. It was part of the V'hishe Amadal Avotenu, the guarantee, starting with Avram Avinu, that despite how bad things will be, it has an ending point. He said that the oppression of the Jewish people would go until 400 years. It has a max. There is a point where it's going to come to an end. Yosef is telling the Egyptians basically about this terrible famine which is going to befall them. 7 years. It has a max. He tells his brothers, Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem. That's next week's parsha. You'll get out of here. That has an end to it. Galut Bavel, they were told 70 years. Jeremiah the prophet said there's going to be 70 years of destruction, and then it's going to be over. And it did. It says in the book of the Bible. That's basically how long it lasted. And even the Gentile kings were aware of this prophecy, and they were anticipating the end. But one thing we do not have is a specific time when this particular galut, this period of Hester Panim, will come to an end. But we know, we have confidence that it is. We've already seen a kibbutz galiot. That's why I changed it. I didn't say galut because you and I were sitting here. You're in the south side of the land. I'm in the middle over here, and we know that there's large parts of the land of Israel are settled. Jewish people have come back here. We look forward to things becoming even better tonight. By the way, for those watching at home, I'm sorry to say tonight is the 10th of Tevet, which means tomorrow there's no temple tonight. It's not going to be built tonight because the temple is not built at night. Tomorrow is a fast day. We are noting that the tragedy that started with the destruction is still with us a little bit. The temple still lies in ruins, and we hope that we will see the end of all this very soon, and we trust in God that that will be the case. Rabbi Solomon, do you have any closing thoughts before we thank you for joining us and wish you a Shabbat Shalom?
Firstly, thank you. It's been a great pleasure, and I'll end just with those beautiful words, those poetic words that we often sing on Shabbat, Bilbavi Mishkanevne, that we have within ourselves until the time when we're worthy to enter the Bet HaMikdash. We have within ourselves a possibility of building ourselves from within, building ourselves with Emunah, with Torah, with Chesed. You know, the Chafetz Chaim references Mishnah Pirkei Avot al Shloshah Dvarim ha'olam omed al Torah v'al avodah v'al gemilut chasadim. And he says avodah is really expressed in the Bet HaMikdash. So what do we have? We have Torah and we have Chesed. Rav Chaim Vital said every day you should ask yourself, have I learned and have I done Chesed? And that's what we really need to do, and especially in this really, really difficult year, this year when many people have died, many people have suffered physically and economically. Our task is to learn and to strengthen our relationship with God. And our task is also to do chesed, to reach out, to give the gift of the person, which is chesed, the gift of love. And through doing that, we can bring redemption to one life and then please God another. And then the Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to say, you got it. You got the message. If you redeem others, I'll redeem you. And Yosef begins the process of redemption by providing for others. He begins a process of redemption by forgiving others. Ironically, at the very chapter where our Shibud begins, we see benevolence, we see forgiveness, we see kindness, we see the ability to look beyond the present towards the future. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to model that in our lives. And if we do that, we begin that process of Bilvavi Mishkan Evneh. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you're building inside, I'll build outside. He says, you're doing the chesed and the Torah, I'll bring back the avodah. And so Tzipita Yeshua is something which we need to, function with and focus on every day. We do so in our tefillahs, but we also need to do so through our ma'asim, through our actions. Build and God will build, and grow and God will grow. We have two brachot in the Amidah. One is about physical growing. One is about that organic growing. Rav Volbe speaks about it so powerfully. And he basically says, you do what you can organically, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will do what he can in terms of the building blocks of Beis HaMikdash.
Oh, beautiful. Well, okay, thank you, Rabbi Solomon, for that inspiration. I look forward to having the opportunity to meet with you. Also, everybody we speak to in the Chatzrot Beit Elokeinu, we should merit to be there to keep all the mitzvot, and all that we do now should go beyond the theoretical, and it's just study for preparing, and we should merit to actually keep all of the mitzvot with our in practice together, and we can't give a greater blessing than that, just to continue growing in our study and in our practice. Thank you very much, everybody out there. Don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Send in your questions or comments. Rabbi Solomon, do you have a website? We didn't plug it. Do you say
RabbiJohnnySolomon.com. There you go. It's kind of easy to find.
Okay, check out Rabbi Johnny Solomon. What's the URL there?
RabbiJohnnySolomon.com. Literally that.
Okay, so spell it the way it is on the screen here, and check that out. And we thank you very much. And we'll see you next week with our other special guest. We'll send out the announcements of that real soon. Check in again Thursday night, 8 p.m. Israel time. Have a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much.